December 1st, 1974, 11:09 a.m. 92 people on board, 1,670 feet, a mountain. 8 seconds between the first warning and impact. The crew had no alarm, no alert, nothing. Just a radio altimeter chime and a first officer saying, "Boy, get some power on." The airplane was 44 nautical miles from the runway. It should have been at 3,400 feet. It was at 1,800. The crew didn't know the difference. The controller didn't say a word. But somewhere at United Airlines, there was already a memo, written weeks earlier, warning this exact thing was coming. It never left the building. How does a warning that already exists fail to save 92 lives? The story of TWA Flight 514 begins not with a disaster, but with an ordinary morning. At 8:53 a.m. on December 1st, 1974, a Boeing 727 pushed back from the gate in Indianapolis under gray winter skies. The aircraft, registration November 54328, had been delivered to Trans World Airlines in early 1970 and had accumulated just under 12,000 hours in routine commercial service. No deferred maintenance. 3 Pratt & Whitney JT8D engines, all within limits. A healthy airplane doing exactly what it was built to do. Up front sat 3 pilots. The captain, 44, had logged around 6,900 hours with nearly 2,900 on the 727. He knew the Washington area well, its airspace, its weather, its quirks. The first officer, 40, carried 6,200 hours, over 1,000 on type. The flight engineer, 31, was the newest, 2,800 hours total, only 128 on the 727. His job was to monitor engines, fuel, pressurization, and back the pilots up with callouts and checklists. All 3 had received adequate rest and were reported in good shape. From their perspective, this was just another winter day on the line. The first leg to Columbus was uneventful. They landed at 9:32, reviewed updated weather for Washington, low clouds, increasing winds, but still inside planning limits. Then welcomed 85 passengers aboard and pushed back at 10:24, 11 minutes behind schedule. 92 souls on board, course set for Washington National Airport. In the cabin behind them, 85 passengers settled in for what most expected to be an uneventful hour of flying. Coats were stuffed into overhead bins, seatbelts clicked shut. Among the passengers was Brigadier General Roscoe Cartwright, one of the United States Army's first black generals, recently retired, traveling with his wife. The flight attendants moved through the aisle counting heads, checking seat backs, closing overhead compartments. The door sealed shut, the jet bridge pulled away, and the 727 taxied out into the gray, Ohio morning. It was the kind of flight that disappears from memory the moment you land. Nobody had any reason to think otherwise. But as the flight moved closer to the capital, the weather was getting worse. And the problem was not the clouds, it was the wind. National's only runway suitable for a 727 ran north-south, and the winds were now blowing from 070 degrees at 28 knots, gusting close to 50, almost perpendicular to the runway, well beyond the aircraft's crosswind limits. Landing at National was no longer an option. To understand why this mattered so much, you need to know what crosswind limits actually protect against. When an aircraft is flying en route, wind is not really a problem. Even at 100 knots or more, it simply shifts the aircraft's track, and the crew adjusts the heading to compensate. But landing is different. The runway is fixed in its direction, and the airplane has to align with it in the final seconds before touchdown. If the wind is blowing across the runway, the crew has to point the nose into the wind to stay on course, a technique called crabbing, and then kick in rudder at the last moment to straighten the aircraft along the center line. If the crosswind is too strong, that final correction becomes uncontrollable. The aircraft can be pushed off the runway, or worse, the wing on the downwind side can dip and strike the ground. Manufacturers test for this and publish maximum crosswind components during certification, typically around 30 to 35 knots for most airliners. At National, the crosswind that morning was pushing 50. There was no safe way to land. The crew coordinated with TWA dispatch and diverted to Washington Dulles International, farther west into Virginia. The ceiling at Dulles was lower, around 900 feet, but the critical difference was the runway. Runway 12 pointed roughly into the wind, making the landing gusty but manageable. The captain handed controls to the first officer to free himself for the replanning and stayed as pilot monitoring. The diversion required very little adjustment. Everyone knew Dulles, plenty of fuel, nothing exceeded anyone's limits. As the crew reviewed the approach plate for runway 12, the flight engineer set the radio altimeter bug to 100 feet, a standard TWA procedure, routine enough that no one remarked on it. That device would sit silent for the entire descent until the aircraft passed within 500 feet of the ground. On a normal approach, its chime would come in the final seconds before landing. But Flight 514 was not heading for a normal approach, and the next time that chime sounded, there would be no runway beneath them. Washington Center began stepping the flight down through descent clearances, each one acknowledged, dialed in, and flown as given. The 727 tracked toward the 300-degree radial of the Armel VOR, the line that would become the final approach course into Dulles. Everything was by the book, but somewhere ahead, hidden inside the clouds, the Blue Ridge Mountains were waiting. To understand what happened next, you need to know how this approach worked. Runway 12 had no ILS, no electronic glide slope guiding the crew down. Instead, it used a VOR/DME approach built around the Armel VOR at the airport. Pilots selected a specific bearing from that beacon, the 300-degree radial, and tracked it inbound to the runway. But unlike a precision approach, there was no continuous descent path. The procedure was a series of step-downs, specific altitudes tied to specific fixes along the route. The first fix was Round Hill, 18 nautical miles from the station. That was where the published approach officially began, and where the altitude dropped to 1,800 feet. Before Round Hill, the minimum altitudes were significantly higher, 3,400 feet from one direction, 3,000 from another, designed to protect aircraft from the rising terrain of the Blue Ridge below. At 10:51, Washington Center gave the crew a heading to intercept the 300-degree radial, cleared them to maintain 8,000 feet, and told them the radial would be for the VOR approach to runway 12. The crew acknowledged. But here was the problem. The controller had set them up for a straight-in intercept from a direction not depicted on the approach chart. No published route, no labeled minimum altitude for the segment they were actually flying. This was operationally common, but it meant the crew was now heading toward terrain that rose to nearly 1,900 feet, with no charted altitude protecting them on that specific path. At 11:01, the controller cleared Flight 514 down to 7,000 feet and handed them to Dulles approach. The captain checked in, and Dulles replied with a clearance to proceed inbound to Armel and expect the runway 12 approach. Then, at 11:04, 5 seconds after the crew reported level at 7,000, the controller spoke 6 words. TWA 514, you're cleared for a VOR/DME approach to runway 12. The captain acknowledged, and immediately said, 1,800 is the bottom. The first officer replied, start down. The logic felt airtight, cleared for the approach. Initial approach altitude on the chart, 1,800 feet. So 1,800 is where they should go. This instinct, to descend immediately after receiving an approach clearance, was not unique to this crew. In the early 1970s, most non-precision approaches were flown using what pilots called the dive and drive technique. Instead of following a gradual, stabilized descent path, crews would descend as quickly as practical to the minimum altitude for their current segment, level off there, then fly to the next fix before descending again. This was not considered sloppy or reckless. It was standard training, the way nearly every airline pilot in America had learned to fly instruments. The smooth, continuous descent profiles used on non-precision approaches today were still a relatively new concept and had not yet become common practice. And critically, pilots had come to believe that if dangerous terrain existed along their route, air traffic control would either withhold the approach clearance or attach an explicit altitude restriction to it. The fact that no restriction was given felt like confirmation that the path was safe. The flight engineer confirmed the descent. Out of 28 for 18, someone said, 1 to go. The autopilot took the 727 down through the clouds. But they were still 44 miles from the airport. Round Hill was more than 25 miles ahead, and the terrain between their position and that fix was climbing. The chart showed it, small symbols marking elevations of 1930 and 1764 on either side of their course. TWA's own policy required 2,000 feet above the highest terrain when not on a published segment. That meant roughly 4,000 feet, not 1,800. None of that registered, because in the early 1970s, a phrase had quietly taken on a meaning it was never designed to carry. Most pilots believed cleared for approach meant cleared to descend to the initial approach altitude. Most controllers did not. Controllers believed that once an aircraft was navigating on its own, no longer receiving radar vectors, terrain clearance became the crew's responsibility. No altitude restriction was required. But pilots, accustomed to controllers routinely directing them below charted minimums using lower minimum vectoring altitudes, had learned to trust that radar contact meant terrain protection. The absence of a restriction felt like permission. Two different assumptions, same three words. No one had resolved the contradiction. If you're finding this story valuable, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps. Now let's get back to the cockpit. As the 727 descended, the ride got rougher. Turbulence built steadily, the kind that makes altimeters jump and needles bounce. The first officer said he hated the altitude jumping around. Then, you can feel that wind down here now. On the ground below, residents would later report visibility as low as 50 feet, with howling winds raking the mountaintops. The crew saw none of this. They were buried in cloud. Beneath the overcast, the landscape west of Dulles was nothing like the flat coastal plain around the airport. The terrain climbed steadily as it moved away from Washington, folding into the foothills and then the ridgelines of the Blue Ridge. The highest point along the cruise track rose to 1,930 feet, only 130 feet below the altitude they were flying. But inside the cockpit, buried in solid cloud at 230 knots, there was no way to see any of it. The instruments showed the aircraft on course, on speed, descending to the altitude they believed they had been cleared to fly. Everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. That was the danger. The instruments were telling the truth about the airplane. They were telling nothing about what was below it. Then the captain paused. He studied his chart more carefully, and he said it. You know, according to this dumb sheet, it says 3,400 to Round Hill is our minimum altitude. The flight engineer asked where he saw that. The captain pointed to the chart. The first officer started to speak. Well, but, and the captain finished the thought for all of them. When he clears you, that means you can go to your initial approach altitude. Someone said initial approach. Someone else said yeah. The captain had read the correct number out loud, 3,400 feet. The answer was in his hands, and all three pilots agreed to set it aside. The clearance overruled the chart. The door closed. In the cabin, the passengers had been feeling the turbulence for several minutes now. A steady, uncomfortable shaking that rattled overhead bins and sloshed drinks on tray tables. Some tightened their seatbelts. Others stared out the windows at solid gray. The flight attendants had long since taken their seats. At 11:08, the flight engineer said, "Dark in here." The first officer replied, "And bumpy too." The altitude alert horn sounded, confirming they had reached 1,800 feet. The captain said he had seen the ground a minute ago. The first officer said he had too. Neither questioned why they could see ground at an altitude where terrain should have been thousands of feet below. Then the first officer called for power. The captain noted a high sink rate, and then someone in the cockpit said it. "We're going uphill." Going uphill. At 1,800 feet, 40 miles from the runway. Someone had recognized it. The terrain was rising beneath them. But the flight engineer answered immediately. "We're right there, we're on course." The captain said, "You ought to see ground outside in just a minute. Hang in there, boy." The flight engineer tried to lighten the mood. "We're getting seasick." The altitude alert sounded again. The aircraft had dropped more than 100 feet below 1,800. The first officer blamed a downdraft. It was not a downdraft, it was the mountain. At 11:09 and 14 seconds, the radio altimeter chime cuts through the cockpit. That device, set to 100 feet back in Columbus, silent for the entire flight, speaks for the first time. 500 feet above the ground, not above sea level, above the trees directly below. The first officer says one word, "Boy." 6 seconds. The captain says, "Get some power on." The throttles go forward. The engines begin to spool. But a 727 does not produce full thrust instantly. It needs seconds. Seconds that no longer exist. At 11:09 and 20 seconds, the radio altimeter chimes again. 100 feet. At 11:09 and 22 seconds, TWA Flight 514 strikes the western slope of Mount Weather at 1,670 feet, 230 knots. The aircraft shears through 70-foot trees, travels 500 feet through the forest, and slams into a granite outcropping. Wreckage scatters across 900 feet. Fires erupt across the debris field. All 92 people on board are killed. The flight data recorder, recovered from the wreckage, would later show a continuous descent from 7,000 feet with little rate variation. The aircraft simply flew itself downhill through the clouds at a steady 230 knots. There were minor altitude excursions of 1 to 200 feet as turbulence pushed the aircraft around, but the overall trend never changed. The vertical acceleration trace showed increasing G-load fluctuations in the final minutes, consistent with strong winds moving over rising terrain. The gear was up. The flaps were up. The leading edge devices were retracted. The airplane was in cruise configuration, clean and fast, at the moment it hit the mountain. The approach controller watches his scope. He keys his microphone. TWA 514, say your altitude. No reply. He calls again. Silence. The mountain the crew hit was not just any mountain. Buried inside Mount Weather sat one of the most classified facilities in the United States, the Emergency Operations Center, a bunker designed to preserve the American government in the event of nuclear war. The crash severed the facility's main phone line. Service was restored in 2.5 hours. The bunker itself was undamaged. Most of it lay hundreds of feet underground. But the accident drew the first significant public attention to a place the government had spent decades keeping secret. Investigators from the NTSB pulled apart the sequence and found a failure that ran through every layer. The immediate cause, the crew descended below the minimum safe altitude, resulting in controlled flight into terrain. But that descent had not happened in isolation. It had unfolded inside a framework of procedures and assumptions that quietly permitted it. The investigation board itself split. A majority concluded the controller's actions were technically allowable. A dissenting group argued that Flight 514 was still a radar arrival, and the controller should have issued an altitude restriction. What both sides agreed on was that the phrase "cleared for approach" carried two completely different meanings, depending on who heard it. And no one had resolved that contradiction. Then came the discovery that made the accident not just tragic, but preventable. 6 weeks earlier, a United Airlines crew had flown the exact same approach into the exact same runway. They too descended to 1,800 feet after receiving an early approach clearance without an altitude restriction. They too passed over the same terrain. They survived by chance, not recognizing the danger until their debrief after landing. United conducted an internal review, found the problem was widespread among their pilots, and issued an internal bulletin. But that bulletin never left the company. No industry-wide reporting system existed. The information sat in a filing cabinet, while the same mistake repeated itself 6 weeks later, this time with no margin left. And it was not just one crew. United's review found that some of their pilots were routinely descending below published minimum altitudes after receiving early approach clearances at Dulles and other airports, all of them operating under the same assumption that the clearance itself implied permission. The pattern was not isolated, it was systemic, but the bulletin United issued stayed inside United. At the time, there was no mechanism, no anonymous cross-airline reporting channel that could have carried that warning to TWA or to any other carrier. Safety reports existed only within a handful of individual airlines, sealed behind company walls. The rest of the industry flew on, unaware that the same trap was waiting for the next crew that didn't ask the right question. It went back further. TWA had warned the FAA about this exact ambiguity in 1970. The Air Force had raised it in 1967. TWA had specifically warned the FAA that the language in the Airman's Information Manual and the Air Traffic Control Handbook created conflicting expectations between pilots and controllers, that a crew hearing "cleared for approach" and a controller saying "cleared for approach" were not agreeing on what those words authorized. The FAA had responded that pilots were ultimately responsible for their own terrain clearance and that no change was necessary. The Air Force had gone further, pointing out that their own military pilots were descending below safe altitudes after receiving civilian approach clearances, and requesting that the FAA require controllers to include altitude information with every approach clearance. The FAA agreed in principle, then made changes to the controller manual that still did not require altitude restrictions. Correspondence between the military and the FAA continued for 7 years, and 30 minutes before Flight 514 began its approach, an American Airlines captain flying the same procedure had paused and asked his controller what altitude he was authorized to descend to. He got an answer. He landed safely. The information existed everywhere. It reached no one who needed it in time. The changes that followed rewrote commercial aviation. The FAA published a formal pilot controller glossary, defining exactly what cleared for approach meant and what it did not. New regulations required pilots to maintain their last assigned altitude until established on a published approach segment. The phrase, "maintain altitude until established," became standard, words built specifically to close the gap that killed 92 people. Controllers received new guidance, requiring them to warn crews if radar showed an unsafe altitude, even when the aircraft was navigating independently. The assumption that terrain clearance was only the pilot's problem was finally challenged. In direct response to the discovery that United's report had gone nowhere, the FAA and NASA established the Aviation Safety Reporting System, ASRS. For the first time, pilots, controllers, and engineers could file anonymous, confidential safety reports without fear of punishment. The filing cabinet became a nationwide database. Patterns that had repeated in silence could finally be seen and stopped. That system is still in use today. And then there was the hardware. At the time of the crash, no airliner was required to carry a ground proximity warning system. The technology existed. An engineer named Don Bateman had designed it specifically to combat CFIT. The system used the radio altimeter to detect dangerous closure rates with the ground and would shout warnings that demanded immediate action. Terrain, terrain, pull up. It did not care about clearances or chart interpretations. If the airplane was heading for the ground, it spoke. The philosophy behind the system was deliberate. The warnings were not subtle. They were loud, synthetic, and impossible to ignore. Phrases like sink rate, and terrain, terrain, pull up were designed to be startling, even alarming, because by the time they activated, the margin for error was already vanishing. And unlike the approach charts, unlike the controller's clearance, unlike the crew's assumptions about what they had been authorized to do, GPWS did not depend on anyone's interpretation. It measured the physical reality between the airplane and the Earth. If that distance was shrinking too fast, it spoke, regardless of what anyone in the cockpit believed. Flight 514's radio altimeter had chimed at 500 feet above terrain, 8 seconds before impact. GPWS would have warned far earlier, with enough time to climb away. Within months of the crash, the FAA mandated GPWS for all airliners with more than 9 passengers. That rule, born from this crash, is credited with virtually eliminating CFIT among equipped aircraft. GPWS and its successor, the Enhanced Ground Proximity Warning System, are widely regarded as the most important safety devices ever installed in a commercial airplane. The radio altimeter, set to 100 feet back in Columbus, is no longer the last defense. It is now one input inside a system that watches, calculates, and speaks when the crew cannot see what is coming. On the morning of December 1st, 1974, a flight engineer set a radio altimeter bug to 100 feet and moved on to the next item on his checklist. It was the most routine action imaginable, and it was the only thing standing between 92 people and the silence of a mountain they could not see. Today, that same radio altimeter feeds into a system that would have shouted a warning long before the Blue Ridge ridgeline ever came close. The chime that came 8 seconds too late would now come minutes early, loud enough, clear enough, and early enough to save every person on board. The next time you board a flight and settle into your seat, the airplane carries the legacy of 92 people in its wiring, its language, and its laws. The glossary your pilots use exists because of this flight. The reporting system that catches patterns before they repeat exists because of this flight. And the terrain warning system guarding the space between your airplane and the ground, the one that will shout if every other layer fails, exists because on a gray December morning, a 727 descended into the Blue Ridge Mountains, and the only warning it gave was a chime that came 8 seconds too late. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who has never heard of TWA Flight 514. And if you want to know how another crash changed the rules in ways no one talks about, that story is waiting right here.